Hello YouTube, this is Matt Pullen, and this video is going to be about an opening that I've had in my repertoire for a long time, the Reversed Grunfeld. And in order to try and keep this video short, because the last several times I've tried to make videos, they were always too long, not concise enough. So I'm going to try to mostly keep the analysis to to this position, or this position right here, which I think of as a reverse Grunfeld because I most commonly reach this position with the reverse Grunfeld, but you could also get to it with a ready or a Catalan move order. So let's go back to the beginning and say white opens with knight f3 and black is playing d5, g3 as opposed to d4 or c4, and black is playing c5 and knight c6. This is an aggressive move order. Black is angling to play e5, so that if white is going into a King's Indian attack, then he'll have to play against the exact setup that white would play if this were a King's Indian defense with colors reversed. But white has a couple options here. One of them is to play d4, and d4 denying black the e5 pawn advance, and now instead of a King's Indian attack we have a reversed Grunfeld. And if black were to play c takes d4 and white plays knight takes d4 and black plays e5, then after knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, c4, what we have is a full tempo up on what black would have in the Grunfeld defense, where black is having the broad pawn center and white is playing to attack and put pressure on the pawn center using the power of this bishop on g2 on the long diagonal. This queen's going to hop out to a4, this knight's coming to c3, and after castles the rook goes to not d8, d1, and the idea is to put pressure on the black center and hopefully gain material in some way, shape, or form. But black does not have to play as aggressively as white would in a Grunfeld. For instance, instead of e5, black can just play e6. And the idea is e6 is pretty simple. It would be very modest if white were playing this move against the Grunfeld. But black's goals are different than white's in the opening, and he's just going to play knight to f6, bishop to e7, castles, very conservative development, and then later on figure out what to do to address the center. He could try and play bishop to d7 and only then e5. Or he could play queen to b6. That's a move that white plays sometimes in the Grunfeld to put pressure on the knight. And or just bishop to d7, rook to c8, and possibly a6, b5, this kind of a deal. But white is white is probably going to, in the meantime, be castling and playing pawn to c4, knight to c3. So this kind of an equal middle game, but it exaggerates the power of the bishop on g2 because black cannot develop the queen side as fluidly as he would like. If that makes any sense. Yeah, so that is the reversed Grunfeld, proper, like a Grunfeld defense, but with an extra tempo, bishop g2, which, is always useful. So in this position, say instead of capturing, black is playing e6, a conservative queen-pawn move protects the pawn on c5. And even though this bishop is blocked in, it's not considered to be that much of a problem because it facilitates, black's kingside development, and this bishop can always develop later. So white is castling and black is playing knight f6, and then c4 is c4 is the move that I would recommend to reach this particular position right here, where both sides have the d and c pawns out in the center. But black is gone with the e6 knight f6 development, and white has the fianchetto structure. So another way to reach this position is, say, black plays knight f6 on move 2, and then white just fianchettos, and black's playing e6. It's a common queen's queen's gambit declined move order. So castles and c5 and then c4. You could play d4, of course, but I like to play c4 in this type of position. Because if black is playing d4, then b4 can be effective for white. And with c4 there's the option of exchanging pawns a move earlier to try and reach a Tarrasch defense. So I mean, if knight to c6, and white could try and reach a Tarrasch by taking on d4 on this move, or he could play d4 again, which transposes to this position that we've been talking about. And in this position, so it's black's move. How does he continue his development? If he keeps the tension the way it is in the center and plays his bishop, then white can exchange. He can initiate the exchange of pawns in the center. And after e takes d5, d takes c5, where we've reached a Tarrasch defense, but with black having to waste a tempo capturing this pawn after moving to e7 as opposed to in one move. So I mean, that's e takes d5. After c takes d, black could also try knight takes d5, but then white has e4, and this is pretty strong. If the knight is going back to f6, then white is just playing for a space advantage on the king side with e5. So that's bishop e7. Also, there could be c takes d4 and knight takes d4, which sort of leads into the passive Grunfeld reversed structure that I touched on earlier in this video. But the critical move is d takes c4, and this line is, in my opinion, a lot of fun for white. And I try and reach this position if I see my opponent is just playing the straightforward e6, d5, c5, and bring the knights out, queen pawn defense. So after d takes c4, sort of accepting the Catalan pawn offering, the move I'm recommending is knight to e5. And I don't remember how many games, how many tournament games I've played. I can only remember one time, in a tournament game, reaching this particular position. I've had it a lot in blitz games, and just by doing just a little preparation for white and knowing some of the ideas, you can pick up a lot of points with this idea. Yeah, white is moving a piece for a second pawn, and in the open second pawn. White is moving a piece for a second time in the opening, bringing the knight f3 to e5. But it's for a concrete reason. It's putting pressure on the knight at c6 and exaggerating the power of this bishop on g2 in the opening before black has organized his queen side. So you are pretty much going to see one of three moves from black after coming out with knight takes, or after coming out with 7 knight e5. So bishop d7, knight takes d4, and knight takes e5. Let's look at knight takes d4 first, because it's this move is pretty easy to discuss. It's clearly a blunder. After pawn to e3, this knight is attacked. It has to retreat. If the knight goes back to c6, then white can just capture it. If the knight goes back anywhere else, then white can capture on d8, which draws the king away from the defense of f7. So this is winning material by force. Sorry, I sort of marked up this position, but I mean you can see it. C takes d4. Clearly loses material as well to knight takes knight because of the bishop. So let's look at a real move now. Bishop to d7. This is not often seen, but the idea is reasonable. White could, if he chooses to, triple the pawns by playing knight takes c6, and bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, b takes c6. I do not recommend playing like this. Basically, white has traded away all his strong pieces just to give black a poor pawn structure. But black has better development. Yeah, he's got better control over the center. And, it's no surprise that white's results statistically from this position are quite poor. So instead of trading on c6, I would recommend just simple development knight a3 with the idea of recapturing the pawn on c4 and only later deciding where this bishop will go. After knight 8, the ideal is to play knight a takes c4 and then play a4 to sort of take this b5 move away and give white one of white's knights a permanent home on c4. So I mean, bishop d7, knight ba3 is a pretty fun game, and also the this bishop on g2 makes its presence felt in the opening stages of the game. The main move here is knight takes e5, and after d takes e5, black has a choice here. But some observations about this position. First of all, the white bishop on g2, as pointed out previously, is very strong on this diagonal, and it takes black some moves to figure out what to do on the queen side. And commonly, black is playing something like rook to b8 to get off the long diagonal, and then b6, bishop d7, so that this bishop, which is currently poor, will oppose the bishop on g2. That is one plan that black has to untangle. Also, white has 5 pawns against 4 pawns on the king side, which in terms of a pawn ending is not that great because they are doubled, so white cannot make a passed pawn. But they are good in the middle game for just claiming space on the king side and just trying to squeeze black in that sector of the board. Black, for the time being, has 4-on-2 on the queen side. I mean, he's doubled pawns, but these pawns can force a passed pawn if this were a pure pawn endgame. But I mean, the doubled 4-on-2 doesn't really have it doesn't have much impact in the middle game. Because white can just put a rook on c1 and make the weakness of these double pawns felt if it came down to that. But white is going to try and keep this in the middle game and play with his space advantage on the center and space advantage on the king side. And also, if there were an exchange of queens, for instance, one of the candidate moves for black here is to play queen takes queen. Queen takes d1, and then rook takes d1. Even though the queens are off the board, I mean, white still has the tools to attack. White has a very strong bishop on the long diagonal. Also, by exchanging on d1, black has basically traded his queen from d8 and brought the rook from f1 onto d1. So white is temporarily having control over the d file. And the queen missing on d8 could be problematic in the case of a knight threatening to come to c7. and we'll see that in a little bit. So how is white going to develop the queenside? Well, he's going to play knight to a3 and try and reclaim this pawn. It's not clear in the opening stages of the game where this bishop will go, but currently it certainly has influence on the king side, and might also come to b2 and have influence on the long diagonal in several lines. So the candidate moves are knight to d7, knight to d5, and queen takes d1. So, I mean, let's look at queen takes d1 first, because we already talked about that, and then rook takes. And again, this queen exchange is making black's life a little safer, but giving white a dangerous tempo, in my opinion, by bringing his rook to d1. And black's knight is attacked. He has a couple different moves, well, 2 or 3 different moves. Knight d5 is the main move, sort of blunting the long diagonal. And I just realized here that I didn't enter, what happens in the event of white taking. I mean, it looks like white can just take on d5 right away and get his pawn back. Bishop takes d5, pawn takes, rook takes, and then just bishop e6. And here, I mean, it's clear that white has given up his strongest piece just for the sake of restoring material equilibrium. And I mean, that's not what this opening is about, in my opinion. And I think that black is already better here because of his bishop pair and natural plan to expand the queen side. So there's also knight d7, which I think is too passive, and knight to g4. Both these moves, knight d7 and knight to g4, should be met with knight a3, in my opinion. I mean, against knight to d7, white could, play f4, but against knight to g4, the move f4 is a little bit iffy here, so the next best thing is to play knight to a3. And you might as well just learn one line, because knight to a3 leads to the same position against both knight moves. So knight a3, threatening to recapture the pawn and also possibly come to b5. If black were to play knight takes e5 here, then white develops his bishop with purpose, hitting this knight. And this position is very dangerous. White has a frightening lead in development for his pawn. And well, see, the king side pawns are even. Black is currently up 2 pawns on the queen side, but he's going to lose one of them. And there are lots of threats in this position. This long diagonal again sort of keeps the black queen side paralyzed, and this knight may come in, and it's not clear what to do to prevent an immediate disaster. So against either knight retreat, knight d7 or knight g4, white can play knight a3, and if black takes back on e5, then bishop f4 is the only thing you have to remember. The tactics just sort of flow naturally from there, I guess. f6 can also be played in conjunction with knight to g4, but white should take. And now, if knight takes f6, black is giving himself an isolated e-pawn. And so after just knight takes c4 with the idea of b3 and bishop b2, again, this bishop will also be very strong on the other long diagonal. So this position, I would say, it clearly favors white. Even the material is even here, because black has 3-on-2 on the queen side, but now white has a healthy 4-on-3 on the king side. There's also g takes f6, which keeps black's pawns slightly healthier, but then just knight takes c4 with the idea of bringing the bishop to f3, and this knight really doesn't have a good home. So that's knight g4. Let's talk about knight d7 now, and then knight a3. And if black were to take the e-pawn, then bishop f4, the same line that I pointed out before. It's just a transposition of moves. So after knight a3, rook b8 is probably the best move here. Just gain off of the long diagonal. And now knight takes c4, and black should play b6 here. b5, it becomes very difficult for black after knight a5, and is controlling the b7 and c6 squares, and this pawn can't really be taken because of the the pin on the rook on b8. So this is nearly crushing for white. So b6 is a lot sounder with the idea of challenging white's bishop on the long diagonal. So a4 might come with the idea of preventing black from playing b5 and securing c4 for this knight, and then bishop b7, rook a3. Slightly unusual to see this, but the idea is to come to d3, doubling rooks on the d file. It is a very potent position for white. So that is queen takes d and knight d7. Queen takes d and knight d5 is the main technically the main line, I guess. In this position, knight a3 should be played, and white intends again to take on c4, but since the queen is not there, there's also this idea of knight b5. So say black plays c3, to prevent the capture of this pawn. And if if d takes c, then knight takes c. So black is sort of craftily getting rid of his doubled pawn by pushing to c3. But white can play knight to b5, and already there's this threat of bishop takes followed by knight check. So pawn takes on b2 is kind of forced, and then bishop takes b2. And I guess you can judge for yourself if you think white has compensation for the pawn in this position. I mean, this bishop is sort of overprotecting the e5 pawn and can be very influential on the long diagonal. His rooks can come to either b1 or c1 and d1. And in addition to the threat of removing this and playing knight to c7, there's also this knight to d6 check, which if black were to capture and white were to capture with the pawn, would completely open up the long diagonal for white's b2 bishop. And also this also white can try and blow up the blockade on the d file by pushing to e4. So there's a lot going on in this position, and keep in mind white is only down a pawn here. So yeah, that's the whole line with queen takes, and that's the whole line with queen takes d1 followed by knight d5. So the other moves in this position, knight d5 is, I think, in my database the most common move, playing the knight d5 without trading queens. I think knight d7 is too passive because white can play f4 and just gain solidify this pawn and gain a space advantage on the king side. So black has to untie his queen side somehow. The most obvious way to do this is to play rook b8, intending to play b5, which solves the problem of black's queenside pieces getting out and also protects the c4 pawn. So white should play a4 here to stop black from playing b5. And black really wants to get a pawn on b5 to protect this c4 pawn. So b6 here, and as usual a6 is an error, because white will just push the pawn to a5. And if black ever plays b5, white can take en passant on b6. So this pawn, can never come to the defense of the c5 or the c4 pawn. So these pawns are effectively isolated now. So b6, with the idea of getting that move in 2 chunks after, say, a6 and b5. So knight a4, knight a3, this familiar move, trying to recapture here. And after bishop to b7, with the idea of exchanging these bishops, white can just close the position by playing pawn to e4. And black's queenside pieces are a little cluttered here. I guess the best move, maybe bishop a8, with the idea of getting in a6 and b5. But, this white could just reclaim the pawn on c4. And I like white's position there with the the potential to advance the f pawn and try and crack open some lines on black's king side. So black is definitely suffering from space in that variation with knight d7 and f4. Let's see what else is there. I guess knight d5. This is the old, back to the main line, I guess. So knight a3 here, is just intending to capture the pawn on c4 and then, play a4 to give this knight a home on c4. And in this position, the most common move is c3, but black does not have to play that. Let's talk about some other moves here. a6 with the idea of b5. This has been seen in several games, but it just looks bad. After knight takes c4 and b5, white can respond with a4. And the idea is after this knight goes away, there can be knight to d6 check. So let's say knight b4. This is the usual square that black retreats or advances the knight to when white plays e4, because black is trying to gain control over the d3 square. But here, in this particular position, there's knight d6 check, and as usual, black pretty much has to take this, and then e takes d. And in this position, there's only a couple moves that really make sense here. After castles, white can play pawn to e5, and it's got protected passed pawn on d6. This bishop is breathing fire on the long diagonal. And after rook b8, there's bishop e3. White is clearly better here. So bishop b7. I think this move has a better reputation, but is still quite dynamic after white is playing queen to g4, pressuring the g7 pawn, with the idea of bringing the knight to the rook to d1, and then developing this bishop to e3. So that is the variation with a6 and b5. I think it's just not. It just doesn't respect white's idea of playing knight d6 check and e4. So see bishop e7. Just developing conservatively with knight takes c4 and castles. And white has a variety of moves here, and it is not clear what is best. He can play for like b3, bishop b2, or he can just play a4 and keep the knight, give the knight a home on c4 where he can't be hit with pawns. Or he can play like queen e4, queen g4 at some point. Maybe even f4 with the idea of leaving the pawn on e2 to guard the d3 square. But I mean, white should have. I mean, this is equal material. I mean, picturing this pawn back on the c file, and everyone's got equal pawns. So it should be comfortable for white. I mean, black has not solved the problem of his queen side yet, and the bishop is still quite influential. So that's bishop e7, just followed by castling. Bishop d7 is a decent idea, with the idea of coming to c6. After knight takes c4, bishop to c6. C. What does white have in this position? Petrosian Pano 1969 continued a3, simply stopping the knight from ever going to b4. But I think this is a little slow. After rook c8, e4, knight b6. I mean, white then dropped the knight on d6 for check, and then bishop takes, e takes. And here, black played knight c4, and then the continuation was queen g4, queen takes d6, queen takes g7, queen d4, and the game ended in a draw. Again, that's after a3, move which strikes me as being a little slow in this position. f4 is also an interesting move. Leaving the pawn on e2 for the time being, to so d3 is not falling under black's control. And I guess see what move is left. e4. This has not been played very often, but I think it's quite possible as long as white is prepared to sacrifice the exchange. For instance, after e4, knight b4, again trying to clamp down on the d3 square. Knight d6 check, bishop takes, pawn takes, and bishop to b5. Now, if white were to move the rook, just shift the rook over onto the open file, then black is sticking this knight into d3, with the idea of following up by capturing the pawn on d6. And this is pretty good for black. But what about instead of moving the rook, white were just to keep developing, bishop e3, and lose the exchange? After bishop takes, is to the best of my knowledge, this exchange sacrifice has never been played before, but it seems quite promising. The threat is bishop takes c5, and this bishop is in this particular line more influential on the f1 a6 diagonal than it is on the long diagonal. For instance, after rook c8 to protect the pawn, bishop b5 check, knight c6, bishop takes, and it's obvious that the bishop and pawn are worth more than the rook in this position. So the exchange sacrifice idea, with e4, is definitely worth looking into. There's probably an improvement somewhere there for black, but I mean, it looks dynamic, and I would try that for white. So those are alternatives to c3. So say black plays c3 in this position. B takes c3. Again, this simple move is best, because after b takes c3, what white would like to do is to push the pawn to c4. By pushing the pawn to c4, forcing this knight to move, and opening up the long diagonal for white's bishop without giving up the d3 square. So knight takes c3, and white should definitely not trade queens in this position, just play queen c2. And this forces black to do something about his knight. I believe knight d5 is best, just retreating back to d5. Queen a5 is, also protects the knight, but I think that black is nearly losing here. After knight c4, queen b4, knight d6 check, bishop takes d6, e takes d6. Because black is up a pawn currently, and if he can capture this pawn on d6, he'll be up 2 pawns, but that is easier said than done, because white is going to play bishop to b2, threatening the knight, and then bring this rook over to d1 behind the pawn. And this other rook will come to b1, and white is going to have two terrific bishops, one on this long diagonal, one on this long diagonal. And black has, it's got very bad development here. So that's queen a5. So after this knight, after queen c2, and this knight just retreats back to d5, white just plays rook d1. And I think I'll wrap up here by saying that I believe white has sufficient compensation here. I mean, white is threatening just to play e4 and, clobber this knight, but there are ways for black to deal with this threat. But in the long term, this rook could come to b1, and all of white's heavy pieces are on good files in that case. This queen is well placed on c2, where it affects the center and also keeps watch over black's king side. This knight could come to c4 and d6 at any time. And again, this bishop is still has yet to be checked in terms of its influence on the long diagonal. And I guess I kind of just spammed the screen with lines here, so let's clean up some of this stuff. So yes, this has been an exploration of this particular reverse Grunfeld line with 7 knight to e5. And I hope you got something out of this, and you learned some things about that are specific to this variation that you might want to add into your just might want to give it a spin the next time you get a chance. So yeah, thanks for watching this video, and have a good day.